My question for you is, how would humans go about colonizing the planet Mars? You can assume that there are no extraterrestrial life forms that are antagonizing. Google's GCA interview is notoriously tough to crack. And there's not a lot of good information out there about how to approach the general cognitive abilities interview at Google. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to ace your GCA interview at Google. I'll start with teaching you why the GCA interview exists and why it matters for hiring at Google. Then I'll talk you through what interviews are looking for and what they expect. And then I'll share with you the best framework for answering the Google GCA interview questions. Make sure you stick around to the end to learn how to handle those pesky interviewer follow-up questions without losing your cool. Welcome to the Pocketboard channel, where industry mentors share their expertise to help you navigate your current professional goals. I'm Erika, and I'm the founder of Pocketboard, and I'm also a mentor on Pocketboard. I love helping people land their dream jobs because I know how life-changing the right career and job can be. I'm a former Google hiring manager who's conducted literally hundreds of GCA interviews, and I've been the one who had to make the final decision on whether someone passed or failed their GCA interview. I'm also an interview coach, and 93% of the people that work with me land their dream jobs. We're going to start by walking through why Google asks general cognitive abilities GCA questions. Why do they reserve an entire interview spot for GCA? This really gets back to how Google thinks about hiring people. A lot of companies want to hire you for what you bring to the table today. Can you do this job today that we have in front of you? A lot of companies, including other FANG companies, focus on whether you can do the job at hand. Google doesn't hire you for what you can do today. Of course, it's important that you can deliver on the tasks and responsibilities of the job today, but they're really looking at how much horsepower do you bring to solve the problems of tomorrow, the problems we don't even know we're going to have in the future. And this is where the GCA interview comes in. Because Google focuses on hiring people for their potential in the future, because Google has a long-term lens on when they hire people. If you have a lot of horsepower and you have really strong cognitive abilities, you're more likely to be the right person in the future to solve problems we can't even think of today. So part of Google cognitive abilities is understanding how big you can think. The other part of it is understanding how you simplify problems, how you assert assumptions, and how you synthesize information and data, as well as your own experience and intuition and judgment to come up with a reasonable path forward. One of my favorite quotes about innovation comes from Henry Ford. When he's asked, why did you invent the car? How did you even think about inventing the car? He was like, I had to think bigger. I had to think a lot bigger than what people were thinking at the time. And the famous quote basically goes, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said, I want faster horses. They wouldn't have even thought of the automobile. It wasn't even on consumers' minds. So it was Henry Ford's job to understand that there was a bigger problem to solve here. Not just 10% faster than horses, not just 20%, not just faster horses, but an entirely different way of thinking about how you get people from A to B. So Google wants to hire people that are thinking about, how do I make something 5 or 10% better than it is today? They want to hire big thinkers that can take in a lot of information, create and state specific assertive assumptions that help them narrow down the problem, simplify a path forward, and synthesize a reasonable approach to solving big problems. So now that you understand why Google asks GCA questions and their hiring philosophy and why they're looking for big thinkers that have strong synthesis muscles, you can understand why it's an entire interview reserved for your onsite. Next, I'm going to start talking about my tips for how to ace your GCA interview at Google. The first tip starts with shifting your mindset. I want you to move from thinking of yourself as a candidate who's being assessed by your interviewer to thinking about your interviewer as a peer and someone who's working through a problem together with you. The GCA interview, more than any other interview at Google, is going to be the most representative of what it's like to work with the person sitting across the table from you. When you move your mindset from thinking about how to answer the question right, you acknowledge the fact that GCA questions just don't have a right answer. And by using your interviewer as a peer, you're really helping to engage them in your thought process and you're showing them how you think. One of the heuristics that I tell people to think about is imagine the last really awesome lunchtime conversation you had with a coworker, where you were waxing philosophical about something that didn't have a right answer, didn't have a path forward, wasn't related to your specific work, but was kind of, riffing on something interesting and intellectually curious to you. That is how it should feel if your GCA interview question is going well. Okay, so what does it mean to take your interviewer and treat them less like an interviewer and more like a peer? Think about solving the problem together as opposed to them giving you a problem and you solving it. Think about how you can leverage them to get information, to thought partner, to share their perspectives to solve this problem together. The second tactic I'll share with you on how to move your interviewer from treating them like an interviewer to treating them like a peer is to engage them in your process. This can involve a lot of check-in. So one thing you're going to do is you're going to share a lot about what's happening in your mind. The second thing you're going to do is every time you move forward in the process, the framework that I'm about to teach you, I want you to stop and check in with your interviewer. Is there anything I'm missing? Is there anything you'd like me to add? Is there anything you'd like me to focus on as I continue thinking through this question? Do you see anything missing from what I've stated so far? This is engaging them in the process, giving them a chance to problem solve with you. And lastly, as part of adjusting your mindset, I want you to think about how you can enjoy the process. GCA questions are really terrifying when you don't know what they are and when you think that there's a right answer and you think that there's a way of acing the interview. When you think about it more as an impossible problem to solve and you think about it more as a partnership with your interviewer, you can really start to enjoy these interviews. And I will tell you that GCA interviews are my favorite interviews, both as a candidate and as the interviewer. Your goal is to get to the same place where you look forward to that GCA interview. Next in my tips around how to ace your Google GCA interviews, I want to talk about what it means to actually share your mindset, to share your brain thinking patterns, to show and demonstrate your cognitive abilities. First, I want to get on the same page about the goal of GCA. We already stated why Google uses GCA to find candidates that they think are going to be fantastic employees for the long haul. But the actual mechanics of the GCA focus on understanding the way your brain works. And in order to understand your abilities, sometimes we have to push those abilities to the limit. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means, how that feels, and how to deal with the feelings of getting to the limits of your cognitive abilities. But first, I want to talk about how you actually share your cognitive abilities. And the number one thing you're going to do to share your cognitive abilities is talking. You're going to show how your brain thinks by sharing the thoughts as they come along. So unlike other interview questions where you're going to be taught frameworks like STAR++ or taught frameworks about how to answer product design or product strategy questions, there's no specific framework to use here. I'm going to teach you an approach that's generally sound, but I want you to remember there's no specific framework to use here. It's really about talking out loud. Once you get comfortable with the idea that you're going to be talking out loud a lot, you probably want to know what should I be talking about. So the first thing I want you to talk about is clarifications. So you're going to be given a question that doesn't have a right answer. So the only way you can kind of narrow it down to a solution space that you can dive into is to ask clarifying questions. By asking clarifying questions, you're engaging your interviewer, you're speaking out loud, and you're gathering more information and data that you can use later to demonstrate your synthesis process. Hi everyone, this is Future Me dropping in on this video to let you know that you should please take a second to subscribe to our channel, ring the bell so you get notified every time I drop a new video, and then if you're enjoying the video so far, go ahead and give it a like to cheer us on. Nothing is off the table at the beginning of your GCA question answer. Think really big. What is the craziest idea that you can share? Later on in the process, you're going to focus on simplifying, narrowing down, and synthesizing. But at the beginning, as you're asking clarifying questions, as you're brainstorming through possible factors that would affect the solution to the problem, you should be thinking as big as possible. By thinking big out loud, you're showing the expansiveness of your thinking. Once you get comfortable with that, now you have to start thinking about how am I going to simplify my thinking? Most GCA questions have an infinitely large solution space. So you need to first gather information, demonstrate your expansive thinking, and then use the information that you've gathered to start simplifying the problem and narrowing the solution space. Simplification is really about getting to the heart of the challenge. If you get asked an impossible question, there's certainly some part of it that's more impossible than other parts. So you want to focus on what is really the heart of the problem or the challenge that I'm trying to solve. Another aspect of simplifying is understanding where the best starting point is. So understanding the heart of the problem, the biggest challenge, the biggest boulder, and then understanding what is the best starting point. In order to simplify, you're going to need to state some assumptions. Some of those assumptions might have come from the conversation that you're having with your interviewer. Stating assumptions is fundamentally about making the problem narrow and approachable for you. So you can assert any number of conditions, expectations, or state of affairs to be able to simplify and start to narrow down your solution space. The last part of showing the way your brain thinks is showing how your brain synthesizes. So you've shown the expansiveness of your brain, you've shown how you simplify problems, and now you're going to show how you use the information that you've been given, as well as the assumptions that you're stating, to synthesize a path forward for solving this problem. Some GCA questions revolve around solving a problem. Some GCA questions revolve around stating an hypothesis. Some actually revolve around math. So I can't give you a specific thing that you're synthesizing here, but remember that the three things you're trying to show about your brain are: how do you think expansively? How do you simplify and state assumptions to narrow the problem space? And then how do you synthesize data that you've been given, information that you've generated for yourself, assumptions that you've created to narrow the path forward? The three types of GCA questions. You talk to 3 different Google interviewers, they'll probably give you 3 different buckets of GCA questions, but I've asked hundreds of these questions and I've coached people on hundreds of these questions, and I generally think they fall into the following 3 buckets. The first type of question is going to be about your opinions on technology, society, economic policy, changes that are going to happen over some period of time. An example of a question that I would ask in this category would be, tell me what industries you think are going to change most in the next 20 years, and then tell me what's going to change about them. The second type of GCA archetypal question is an estimation question on steroids. So we've all heard the canonical how many golf balls fit into an airplane question, and it's really a question about how systematically you can break down a problem and solve it. GCA questions don't just care about how you systematically break down a problem, they want to see you think big. They want to understand how you synthesize. And so when we ask a GCA question that's an estimation question on steroids, it usually involves breaking down a problem, but also making assertions about the future state and then baking that into your answer. An example question for an estimation question on steroids would be, estimate the size of the self-driving car market in 2040. So I'm asking you to look at the current car market, make assumptions about that, and then I'm also asking you to estimate the future state of the world, to estimate how large the self-driving car market will be in 2040. The last archetypal type of GCA question in my mind is the nearly impossible questions category. I say nearly impossible because what we think is impossible today may very well be solvable in 50 years. And similarly, there are things we've solved today that no one could have imagined 200 years ago. Nearly impossible questions truly do not have a correct answer. While they don't have a correct answer, nearly impossible questions certainly do allow you to demonstrate the breadth and depth of your thinking and your ability to go big and then simplify and synthesize. An example of a nearly impossible question would be, how could humans go about colonizing the planet Mars? All right, the moment you've all been waiting for, my approach/framework for answering Google GCA questions. As I stated a moment ago, there is no specific structured framework like you would see with a product design question or a system design question. It's more about showing the way your brain thinks, but there are some tips that will make it easier to demonstrate strength in your cognitive abilities. So the first tip I shared with you is resetting your mindset from thinking of yourself as a candidate being assessed to a peer having an interesting intellectual conversation about something where there is no right answer. The second tip is to ask clarifying questions. There is no limit to the amount of clarifying questions you can ask. Some people will ask me, okay, but certainly if I ask 50 clarifying questions, that's too much. How do I know when the interviewer is signaling that I've shown enough of my brain's ability to think expansively and when they want me to start shifting into simplification or synthesis mode? Usually what happens is the interviewer will start to say, I think you can address that in your answer, or I'd like you to select that, or I'll leave that up to you. that is usually them signaling that they've gotten enough signal on your brain's expansive thinking and they want you to start simplifying the problem and synthesizing into some sort of solution space. Third tip is always engage your interviewer. I've given you some tips on how to do this. I'm going to reiterate them here. Check in at each step. When you move from big thinking to simplifying to synthesizing, at each moment of those transitions, I want you to check in with your interviewer. Have I missed any assumptions? Is there anything you'd like me to focus on in particular? Is there anything that you would like to add to my thinking about this problem? Check in with them, engage them, treat it like an interesting lunchtime conversation. When you start to go into simplifying mode, make sure you state or assert all of your assumptions. I assume X, Y, and Z. I assert X, Y, and Z. By the time you simplify the problem through the use of assumptions and using the information that the interviewer has shared with you in your clarifying questions, you should be in a solution space that's small enough that you can actually start to think through what would work. If your solution space seems too big, for example, if there's 4 different categories of things that you're still focusing on, this is a good time to check in with your interviewer and say, these are the 4 categories that I think are most important, or the 4 solution considerations that are most important. Is there one in particular that you'd like me to focus on? You can also state that you have a preference of which one you'd like to focus on. I'd like to focus on part A, but if you'd like me to focus on one of the other parts, please let me know. And the last thing I'll share here is that just remember that if it gets messy in the middle there, you can always summarize at the end. But remember that GCA questions are not fundamentally about how systematically you communicate, how concisely or clearly you communicate. It's really about understanding your brain. So only summarize at the end of your GCA question. Unlike lots of other types of Google interview questions, you only need to summarize if it really gets messy there in the middle. I also mentioned to you that GCA questions are some of my favorite questions, so I am going to actually do a question and answer session. I'll try to find a creative way to be both the interviewer and the interviewee, and I want to actually walk you through what one of these questions looks like. Keep in mind that typically for a GCA question, you're going to spend anywhere from 7 to 15 minutes going back and forth with the interviewer. In order to make this video short enough that I'm not going to lose your attention span, I'm not going to give you a full-blown example, but I am going to give you some of the high points of how I would approach this question. Hi, I'm Erika. I'm the interviewer. My question for you is, how would humans go about colonizing the planet Mars? Okay, so the question is, how could humans go about colonizing Mars? All right, I'm going to start with some clarifying questions. First question is this something that humankind is doing together in an allied way, or is it possible that this is happening with a specific country or an alliance of countries? Great question. You can assume that humankind is banding together to build this colony on Mars. Okay, great. Should I assume that there are no extraterrestrial life forms in the picture? You can assume that there are no extraterrestrial life forms that are antagonizing or even helping the problem. Do I have any constraints around budget, timelines, any kind of like resource constraint? From a budget perspective, you can consider the budget fairly large. From a timeline perspective, this is actually fairly urgent. Humans need to actually establish this colony on Mars because the planet can no longer support the number of humans that exist on Earth today. Okay, do we have any history of humans of colonizing on Mars, like pilots or any small scale existing colonies that exist, or are we kind of starting from a blank slate here? You can assume that we have built colonies on other planets or on the moon, but this will be our first colony on Mars. Okay, so you can kind of see where I'm going with this. Unlimited clarifying questions. You can kind of see which questions the interviewer is leaving really open, the ones that they're shutting to simplify the problem, the ones that they're kind of like letting you lean into, for example, by saying that there are other planets that have been colonized, okay? So for the sake of time, I'm going to move forward into the simplification and stating assumptions. Okay, great. So I'm going to start to simplify this problem a little bit to understand a little bit more about how we should think about this approach. So when I think about building a colony, we have some previous experience having built a number of colonies before. So one kind of aspect of going about colonizing Mars is to secure all of the resources. I'm going to assume that the cost resources are infinite, but we will still have to probably build tools, transportation, and systems that allow us to build this colony, have the resources to support life on the planet, and then handle kind of any sort of transportation efforts between Earth and Mars, or Mars and any other nearby colonies on other planets. So I would say just resource alignment is one major category. Another major category to think about is kind of thinking about how large the colony is going to be. Are we moving everyone on Earth? Are we moving a portion of people on Earth? So thinking about population demographics, thinking about the selection criteria. I would kind of call that out as a separate kind of work stream here. A third area of consideration is sustainability. So it takes a long time to get from Earth to Mars. One clarifying question I might ask actually is around transportation. Should I assume the same transportation paradigms that exist today, or have humans at this point figured out how to travel faster? And that gets me to my fourth piece, which is society. Figuring out how we want to organize the colony is kind of another work stream. So all four of these seem really critical. This is obviously a very large solution space. Is there one of these four that you would like me to focus on? Yes, and let me answer your question about transportation. At this point, we do not have a faster way to transport goods, so it is actually extremely important to figure out how we're going to build this colony sustainably. And in fact, in order to simplify the problem a little bit, let's actually just focus on sustainability. And you don't have to figure out societal sustainability yet, but let's just talk about basic how to sustain life. Okay, great. So I'm assuming that transportation paradigms are exactly the same. I'm assuming that society is something to consider later, thinking about government and organization structures. I'm going to assume still that we have an unlimited resource, an unlimited financial budget, but that time is of the essence. So I'm going to continue to assume that time is of the essence. So the most important thing for us to figure out is what are the basic parameters for creating sustainable life on the planet. So this includes both the ability to sustain any colonists that we actually send from Earth, and then also to create conditions that allow them to live long enough and be able to procreate. And so those are the three things that I would focus on here. Even that space feels really large. And so because I think the most foundational aspect of this is the ability to generate water and food and oxygen, any other resources that are required to sustain the initial colonists, because the cost in terms of time of bringing another set of colonists if we fail seems very high. And again, I would assume that we're leveraging all of our resources in terms of learnings from other colonizations. But I want to really zoom in on that. So there are three major factors that I think we have to think about in terms of keeping our colonists alive long enough to create the conditions that would allow them to procreate, which would allow us to have a second generation or first generation of colonists on Mars. And then from there, we can work on solving the long-term food and reproductive sustainability problems as well as society. So generating water is going to be essential. Generating oxygen and figuring out how to deal with any sort of gaseous constraints that we have. And then thirdly, figuring out how to grow a variety of food, produce a variety of food that provides a nutritionally balanced diet, including any sort of nutritional deficiencies that come about from being on the planet Mars that may not also exist on Earth. So those are the three major considerations that I think that we have to focus on first as we look to colonize Mars as a planet. All right, great. So follow-up question. You mentioned that there may be nutritional changes or environmental changes, biological changes that are caused by being on Mars. That we would need to figure out how to adjust for. Walk me through what some of those might be and how you might figure out what they are before we get there. In a lab setting, we would have to create the conditions of living on Mars and start to understand how those conditions affect nutritional, hormonal, differences for colonists, likely differences for colonists from what is on Earth, and we'll have to actually address those through the creation of whether it's light as a resource, whether it's a specific supplement that's a resource, a vitamin. Is there anything you want me to dig into a little bit more there? Is there anything that I'm missing about your question? One of the things that you didn't really address is really the time issue here. I mentioned that it's fairly urgent, and of course we have the time. The travel paradigms that exist today will exist in this experiment. How do you overcome the time problem? Right. So if I understand what you're saying it takes a while to both create all of these resources, figure out what tools we need, figure out what hormones, supplements, food, water creation and water capture, oxygen encapsulation, devices that we're going to need to actually bring with the colonists over. How am I addressing the factors of time? I do think, how can we create the most hermetic environment? And again, leveraging what learnings that we have from other planetary colonies. How can we create a hermetic environment either on Earth or on maybe one of the other colonies that's closest in conditions to the Mars condition, where we can get the nearest sense on what the challenges are going to be, so that as robustly as possible we can design and ship with the colonists the rough materials that they would need to actually have the tools to be able to generate water, oxygen, supplements, food, nutrition, etc. I think what's interesting about the fact that we have this amount of time where the colonists are actually moving from Earth to Mars is that that's actually time where assembly can happen. So one way of saving time could be to actually ship components and have the colonists on board actually learn how to put them together. This also builds their ability to replace, fix, and adjust the plans as they're living on Mars if they actually assemble these devices, these machines themselves. Similarly with food, we could have as part of the transportation infrastructure the starting point of growing food, producing food. I'm being specific about saying producing versus growing because, of course, if the soil conditions aren't favorable, we may have to find another way to produce nutrition for our colonists. And so we can kind of have some of those experiments, if you will, those late stage experiments or assembly kind of finishing processes actually happening during transportation, which could save us a number of years in the timeline. No further questions. All right, so hopefully that example was helpful. You could see me literally go from starting big, asking questions about whether there's, antagonistic extraterrestrials to worry about, to asking questions about resources, timelines, really showing all of the different ways that I could think about this problem, societal norms, how do you, generate essential nutrients and oxygen and the like. To thinking about how we're going to procreate and build the population. So you can really see the expansiveness of my thinking and the answer. And of course, you can go even further in your own interview. Then you saw me simplify. And I wasn't able to simplify to a very small solution space because it's, colonizing a planet is a pretty significant effort. So I was able to break it into 4 kind of major categories. You might have come up with 3 categories. You might have come up with 7 categories. Generally tell people to stick between 3 and 5 major categories. And then if you have a favorite one that you want to dive into, you offer, I'd like to dive into this one, but if I would also like to understand if there's another area that you'd prefer that I focus on. So engaging the interviewer there, you saw me engage them. You also saw me admit when I knew or didn't know something, and I would make assertions or make assumptions. I brought in the context, the answers that the interviewer gave me to the clarification questions. And then lastly, you saw me synthesize into kind of a very small solution space. How do we provide basic nutrition that ensures that our colonists are able to survive long enough to reproduce, to get another generation, to be able to continue iterating, experimenting, and improving the conditions of a colony? But really focusing on what is the core problem here. The core problem is we need to keep our colonists alive because the round trip is so expensive in terms of time. So I really focused on the parameters that the interviewer gave me as the main constraints to work with. Hopefully that was a helpful example. I like asking space questions, but every interviewer gets to make up their own GCA questions. So don't expect a lot of overlap or being able to search the internet to find GCA questions that are most commonly used. There are no commonly used GCA questions. They are generally made up by the interviewers. At the beginning, I promised you a bonus section around follow-up questions. One of the other reasons people tend to quake in their boots about Google GCA questions is that there tend to be a lot of follow-up questions. The reason for this, I alluded to earlier. In order to understand your cognitive abilities, sometimes we need to actually hit your cognitive limits. So what that can feel like as a candidate is you getting pushed into a corner, someone really drilling in. Okay, you're saying that we might have, we have this problem with light in near the poles and in on Earth. How are you extrapolating that problem to a problem on Mars, a planet that is fundamentally different? Really diving in and questioning your assumptions, asking you why many times, asking you how many times repeatedly, till you feel like you're just in this very narrow space backed into a corner. So one of the things that I see candidates doing in this process is starting to shut down. Shutting down is the worst thing you could possibly do. Please do not shut down. Don't ask for a new question. Don't tell them that you're ready to move on. You really need to work with the interviewer here and really explore. I have some tips that I want to share with you on how you work through the discomfort of the interviewer drilling down and potentially even seeming to you intellectually combative as they really try to understand the limits of your cognitive abilities. First, acknowledge that this can be uncomfortable. We often, as intellectuals, sometimes associate too much of their own personal identity and ego with how smart they are. So when someone keeps asking you follow-up questions, it can actually be uncomfortable from an ego perspective. The most important thing you can do, if that is one of the challenges that you're facing, is just acknowledge that you are uncomfortable. And when I say acknowledge, I mean in your own head, not to the interviewer. Second tactic is state what you know. You may not know the answer to the question that they're asking. You probably don't if it's a GCA question. What I want you to do is state what you know and state any assumptions that you might make to be able to move forward. For example, you saw in my example, the interviewer asked me how I would go about saving time. I hadn't thought about how I was going to save time in this experiment. So as I started working through it, I started to think about, there's this real possibility. They're going to need all these tools. What if they could assemble them? What if they could start their herb garden on board? What if they could do things during the actual long time travel that would actually allow us to launch the ship faster and kind of handle the finishing details on the ride? And also I acknowledge that also could create some learning for the colonists that allowed them to be more likely to succeed at building the colony. So it was kind of a win-win. But all of that I came up with on the fly, and you're going to do the exact same in your GCA. It's all about stating what you do know and really working the problem until something comes to you that is a reasonable either assumption or path forward to make. My last tip on how to handle endless and difficult follow-up questions is to never, ever give up. Do not say, I think we're reaching the end of my abilities here. Can we move on to the next question? Keep working with the interviewer until they get what they need, and then you get to move on to the next question. But I think really changing your mindset from candidate to peer at the beginning helps with the feeling of being backed into a corner and like really hitting your cognitive limits can be uncomfortable. But putting yourself into that peer, they're really just trying to understand how your brain thinks and they're trying to find the limits. And if they don't actually hit the wall, they don't know if they found the limit. So just knowing that that's kind of part of the process and it is potentially uncomfortable, but just working with them, stating what you do know, continuing to stick with the problem. The last thing I'll leave you with is the importance of having a coach or mentor. Getting one of these roles at a FANG company, in particular Google, one of the most discerning employers in the world, I liken it to being a top tier tennis player. You may be an exceptional tennis player, but even Serena Williams has coaches. LeBron James has coaches. All of the people that we think of as being really brilliant and capable, they all have mentors and coaches and advisors that help them hone their thinking, hone their skills, and really get very good at seeing around their own blind spots. So I highly encourage you, if you're going through the Google interview process or any FANG interview process, to consider hiring a mentor on Pocketboard who can help guide you through the process, improve the way you tell your stories, give you confidence, and unlock your ability to land your dream job. If you found this video helpful, please give us a like. And if you are in process interviewing right now with Google, please use the comment section to share a little bit more about your experience. You can help someone else out. And also, if you have some questions for us on how you might have performed in your GCA interviews or any of your Google interviews. We respond to every comment. If you want me or other Pocketboard mentors to make other helpful videos for candidates like you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Ring the bell so that you always know as soon as we drop a new video. I'm Erika G, and you can find many more videos on this channel that I've made to help candidates who are going through career pivots, job searches, and trying to land their dream jobs. If you'd like one-on-one help from me, you can book me directly on Pocketboard as soon as tomorrow using the link in the description. Best of luck on your Google interviews. There's no real outtakes for this one because I didn't do anything hilariously bad in this video. So I want to acknowledge two things that people have been asking me. Well, actually, one that people have been asking me and one that I assume they're going to ask me. So thing number one is this plant. This looks so incredibly beautifully placed. This plant is my office companion / my only coworker. It wants to be in the video almost as much as my cat Toby. It actually looks like that. All of its other leaves are low, but this leaf is like, hello, I want to be in the video. So just want to acknowledge that the plant. The second thing I expect people to ask about is my Noogler hat, which is indeed the one that I got when I joined Google, and it is indeed a single propeller situation. Normally there's two propellers, but the other one was unfortunately dislodged when a friend used this as part of their Halloween costume one year. So I am on a single propeller situation here, trying to figure out ways to show me as the interviewer versus me as the candidate. And I thought this was the best disguise available and the most appropriate one, despite the fact that it's slightly injured.